Hello, this is Chapter 3, Settling the Northern Colonies, 1619 to 1700. Let's get started. Just a couple key concepts here. First of all, unlike the southern colonies that were created for a profit, the northern colonies are going to see religion at the center of not just the settlement, but also of the government structure, as well as social norms. These northern colonies will continually push west onto Native American lands, similar to what we saw in the South, and that will lead to armed conflict. And the middle colonies, Pennsylvania, for example, will become the bread colonies. All right, so before we get to the Puritans and the New World, let's talk about the Protestant Reformation. And of course, the German friar Martin Luther denounced the authority of the priests, and he also declared that the Bible alone was the source of God's words. There is Martin Luther himself, and you get one of those hats from me, I think. This will start the Protestant Reformation. Now, a man named John Calvin of Geneva will elaborate on Martin Luther's ideas in this 1536 Institutes of the Christian Religion, and his elaboration forms the basis of Calvinism, and that is the faith that the Puritans and the separatists will bring to the New World. And a big part of that is this concept of predestination. And what that means is that there were some people, the elect they were known, that were predestined to go on to heaven. And then there were those, the others, that were predestined to go someplace else. So as I just said, the elect was the group of people that were predestined to go to heaven, and nobody really knows who was in that group and who was not, unless, of course, your conversion was witnessed. Now, your conversion would be an outward expression of your faith, some sort of sign that God had spoken to you and that you had internalized that, I suppose. At that point, then, you'd be thought of as one of the visible saints. That would be a visible member of the elect. Regardless of which group you were in, everybody was expected to live a sanctified life. So you couldn't just say that I'm not part of the elect, therefore I'm going to do bad things. As a part of the congregation, as a part of the community, to be accepted as a part of the community, you needed to live this very holy, very sanctified, puritanical life. So there are two groups of Calvinists that make the way to the New World. There are the Puritans, and they want to see the purification of the Church of England. They want to get the Catholicism out of England as quickly as possible. And then there were the Separatists, and they wanted to break away altogether from the Church of England. They were especially appalled that the visible saints had to share pews with the damned, as all people worship in the same church. They first actually fled to Holland, and then eventually to the New World. A little shout out to Kay Doll here. If April showers bring May flowers, what do May flowers bring? They bring the pilgrims, of course. Now, the separatists in Holland had come to America in search of religious freedom, as I said early on, and they actually settled outside the domain of the Virginia Company. They missed their spot, and they found themselves in Plymouth Bay in 1620. And before they came to shore, they signed the famed Mayflower Compact. And we will read this in class together and take a look at that document. But essentially, they submit to the will of the majority under the regulations they agreed upon. It's not a constitution. It's not really a government, but it's sort of an agreement to cooperate and follow majority rule. It's signed by 41 adult males. And here's a picture of that. Now, as was the case in Jamestown, the first winter is going to be a tough one for the Pilgrims. 1620 to 1621, only 44 of the 102 males survived. However, none left the following year. In 1621, there was the first Thanksgiving Day in New England, as they had a very nice harvest that year. They were very fortunate to have leadership of William Bradford. He was elected 30 times as the governor of the Pilgrims in their annual elections. He was a self-taught scholar who read Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, and Dutch, and he was basically the leader of this group. The Plymouth colony eventually would be annexed into the much larger Massachusetts Bay colony. Here's William Bradford, by the way, or an artist's depiction of him. And here you can see, down there near Cape Cod, is the Plymouth colony, or the Old Colony as it was called. It never really had much size or any real economic power, and unfortunately for them, they'll be sort of kind of lumped together with the Bay Colony under the new charter. 1629, a non-separatist Puritan group had secured a royal charter to form the Massachusetts Bay Company. This is also called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And there's a great migration in the 1630s in which 70,000 or so refugees will leave England for America. Most of them do not actually go to New England. Only 25,000 will make it to New England. Many instead went to the West Indies, especially the island of Barbados. You can see this. I took this right from our textbook. Quite a nice depiction, visual representation of just how many Puritans actually left in this great migration and found their way to New England, which is kind of strange to think, because we always think of, as a New Englander, we always think of this as like the Puritan haven. But of course, as you can see, that's not necessarily the case. So we should point out that democracy is a bit of a stretch. We shouldn't say necessarily that democracy existed in early New England. Obviously, there was public participation in government, but as it said in the text, one Puritan leader said, "If the people be governors, who shall be governed?" There were, however, annual elections of the governor, of his assistants, and the general court, which was their representative assembly. But only church members could be freemen. So you had to be a member of the congregation. Keep that in mind. Everybody, regardless if you were a member or not, did pay taxes to support the congregational church, similar to what we saw in the southern colonies with tax support for the Anglican church. In many ways, John Winthrop will be to the Bay Colony what William Bradford was to the Plymouth Colony. As you can see, he was governor for 19 years. Here is Mr. Winthrop right there. In the Bay Colony, freemen, these are male Puritan church members, got to vote, but all male property owners were entitled to discuss public issues in sort of the beginning of the town meeting. And again, if you know New England, as we do up here, then you know the town meetings can get pretty heated at times, but it's something that we hold very dearly as well. Issues were voted on by a majority. It was a show of hands. Now, the congregation could hire and fire its minister as well as set his salary, and clergymen were barred from holding public office. So the pageant suggests that perhaps this is like an early example of the separation of church and state, and I think that's a fair assessment to make. The church, however, was central to the New England way of life. Perhaps you've heard of the Protestant ethic in the book, or sometimes referred to as Protestant work ethic. It's pretty extreme to think that if you are idle, you are sinning. But again, it was this idea that your sort of church image, your holy life, was what guided you in every facet of your life. And there was a strong belief in this Protestant Calvinist faith that there was a calling to do God's work. And we are going to be reading this document in class, and I think that you'll read it in English class as well, this idea of building a city upon a hill, sort of a model community to shine light down upon everybody else. So if the church is the center, the Puritan faith, if that's the center of life, well, you better not challenge that. And there's a couple of people we're going to talk about here, the first of which is Anne Hutchinson. And unfortunately for her, she directly challenged Puritan orthodoxy. She also was female, obviously, so being an outspoken, strong-willed female in the 1600s probably did not bode well for her. But she and this idea of antinomianism, this concept that holy life was no sure sign of salvation, and the truly saved need not follow God's or man's law, well, that kind of got her kicked out of the Commonwealth. She also claimed to have come to this realization through a direct revelation from God. And here's a depiction of Anne Hutchinson defending herself. She was banished. Also banished, Roger Williams, for which a fantastic zoo is named for in Rhode Island. He is an extreme separatist. He was a very popular Salem minister. Maybe that had something to do with it, this strong sort of public support. But again, he also challenged the church's ability to regulate religious behavior. And he also said that the charter of the Bay Colony was not legit because it unlawfully took Indian lands. How dare he say something like that? Here he is, Mr. Williams, banished. So, 1644, Roger Williams will establish Rhode Island, and it is probably instantly mocked. It's called the Rhode Island Sewer, it's called Rogues Island, it's called a number of things. But part of what he does there is establish religious freedom for all. There's no taxes for the church, there's no oaths that are required, and no compulsory attendance at worship. He also provided simple manhood suffrage, as in all men could vote. And little Rhody strongly will be individualistic and stubbornly independent. I guess it is now. I don't really know. But again, it was mocked quite badly by the original Puritan settlements. All right, so as you can imagine, these early settlements will spread out. In 1635, Hartford will be founded by the Boston Puritans that were led by the Reverend Thomas Hooker. In 1639, the settlers of the New Connecticut River Colony drafted a document known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. This is a very important document in terms of the development of government in this country. It was basically a modern constitution. Much of it was adopted by the state of Connecticut in their state constitution later on. 1638, New Haven was established, and eventually it would be merged with Hartford when Connecticut was granted its own charter in 1662. Turns out that England was not too thrilled with New Haven, as they did actually help to harbor some fugitive judges, if you want to say that. Edward Whaley, William Goff, and John Dixwell were 3 of the 59 judges that sentenced King Charles I to death in 1649, and Whaley and Goff were hidden in the woods in an area that is now West Rock Ridge State Park in New Haven, in something called Judge's Cave. Supposedly they stayed in this rock formation, which I've been to. It's quite small. I can't imagine it was quite comfortable for them. You can see this map here of Connecticut, the early settlements. There also was a Saybrook settlement, for which Yale University was originally founded, actually, before it moved to New Haven. But as you can see, Massachusetts does make its way southwest. Part of Maine was purchased by Massachusetts Bay in 1677 from the heir of Sir Ferdinando Gorges. There had already been fishing and trading taking place there for quite some time. 1641, New Hampshire was absorbed by the greedy Massachusetts Bay as well, and the king took it back and made New Hampshire a royal colony in 1679. Live free or die, right? I just got back from an annual trip up New Hampshire to play golf, and this is taken at the Mount Washington golf course. That's a bear, folks. There was a lot of bear running around. It was pretty neat. All right, now as I was saying before, these Puritan settlements will have a lot of conflict with the Indians. In 1661, the Wampanoag chieftain Massasoit had signed a treaty with the Plymouth Pilgrims, and the Wampanoag had helped the Pilgrims to be successful with that second year, that second harvest, and that led to the first of Thanksgiving in that same year, a story we all heard on Grandma's knee way back when. In 1637, however, hostilities exploded between the English settlers and the powerful Pequot tribe. The English militiamen and their Narragansett Indian allies annihilated the Pequot tribe. And what they did was they actually surrounded this Pequot fort and they set fire to it. And as people fled, they gunned them down. If you have been to the Foxwoods Pequot Museum, then you may have seen the video depicting this. It's quite gruesome. In 1675, Massasoit's son, his name was Metacom, he was also known by the English as King Philip, launched a series of attacks and raids against the colonist towns. And that war will end in 1676 when King Philip is defeated. I believe he was beheaded and his head was on display for quite some time. This did slow the westward march of the English. Here is King Philip. So one of the things we like to talk about with this whole curriculum, the entire year, would be the sort of the development of the American identity. And we're going to look at this creation of the New England Confederation in 1643 as a very early example of colonial unity. So 4 colonies, the 2 Massachusetts colonies and the 2 Connecticut colonies, matter of fact, came together and they made an agreement to defend against foes or potential foes, and I think primarily they were speaking about Native Americans on the frontier. Each colony, as you can see, had 2 votes, regardless of their size. And as I said already, this is one of the very early steps towards colonial unity. This is something we're going to come back to. All right, so in 1660, Charles II is going to be restored, and what we need to know is not a whole lot about that, but what we should know is that there were new charters issued to Connecticut and Rhode Island, and that the Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter was actually revoked. No doubt Charles is in charge. So this is sort of a brief attempt at more control in the colonies in the 1600s. And in 1686, the Dominion of New England will be created under the leadership of Charles II. And don't confuse this with the New England Confederation, which was an example of early colonial unity. This was sort of forced upon them. It was royal authority which created this. It included New England and later New York and New Jersey. And it was designed to protect the colonies from Indian attacks, as well as to enforce the navigation laws. Now, the navigation laws were designed to stop illegal colonial trade. Again, we haven't really talked about mercantilism yet specifically, but the idea behind colonizing anything was that the colony would serve the parent state. So the colonies exist to make the mother country wealthy. And so any kind of illegal trade that is not being taxed by the British, for example, well, that doesn't necessarily help the mother country. So, in effect, this idea of the Dominion of New England is going to be sort of a government or a watchdog kind of group to make sure that the colonies are protected and that mercantilism is protected as well. Here's a map showing the Dominion of New England, and it'll be led by Sir Edmund Andros. And there he is right there. And he was an able English military man, and he had his headquarters in Boston. And unfortunately for him and for Boston, I suppose, temporarily, he stopped the town meetings. He placed heavy restrictions on the courts, the press, the schools, and he revoked all land titles. As you can imagine, he was not well liked in Boston. Now, in 1688 and 1689, the Glorious Revolution occurred in England, and William and Mary will take the throne. And at that point, Andros is going to be ousted. In fact, he tried to flee the colonies wearing a dress. I guess his boots were sticking out below the dress, and people noticed that, and they captured him. And once they captured him, the Dominion of New England crumbled. There is. The trade restrictions were then relaxed, and this begins the period of salutary neglect. Underline that in your notebook, highlight it, put a star next to it, hashtag salutary neglect. Know that big time. We'll be talking about it for quite some time. In the 17th century, the old Netherlands, became a world power. They earned their freedom from Spain, I believe, and their greatest activities occurred in the East Indies. In fact, they had the Dutch East India Company, and the text says that it was nearly a state within a state. So I'm assuming they had quite a few ships, quite a nice bankroll, quite a lot of soldiers, quite a lot of political influence, the whole bit. They actually hired Henry Hudson to seek great riches, and he sailed into the Delaware Bay and New York Bay in 1609, and then ascended the Hudson River, and he filed a Dutch claim to the area. Now, 1623, 1624, the Dutch West India Company established New Netherland in the Hudson River area, primarily for fur trade, and they will be purchasing the island of Manhattan, some of the most expensive real estate in the world, as the text tells us, from the local natives there for basically nothing. New Amsterdam, which will become New York City, will be a company town, and as it goes, they had built a large wall to defend themselves from neighboring Native American tribes, and that's where the name Wall Street comes from. Now, in my opinion, this is sort of minor details here, but just to say we covered it. This Dutch company town was led by incompetent men, and unfortunately, many of the shareholders demanded dividends, despite the fact that the company needed that money to operate and to thrive. People were demanding to be paid, and so that's not good for the company. They also had Indian troubles on the border, and now there's sort of a Swedish presence as well on the Delaware River, and the Dutch will deal with that by dispatching a small military expedition in 1655. They will lay a bloodless siege, and Swedish rule will come to an abrupt end. And this is the last slide involving the Dutch throughout the entire curriculum of A Push. 1664, the Dutch were forced to surrender their territory to the English when a strong English squadron appeared off the coast of New Amsterdam, which will then be renamed New York in honor of the Duke of York. Now, on to Pennsylvania. There is a group of dissenters, these Quakers. This is a pacifist faith that was said to quake when they were worshiping, they had begun to gain some popularity in England in the mid-1600s. And the Quakers were especially offensive to the authorities, both religious and civil. They refused to support the Church of England with taxes. William Penn was attracted to the Quaker faith in 1660, and in 1681 he secured from King Charles II a very large grant of very fertile land, and the king named it Pennsylvania. Apparently, William Penn wanted to try to change that. He was kind of concerned that people would think down or think low of him for naming this colony after himself. And there he is, William Penn. He actually did advertise his colony more so than anybody else. Now, the Quakers, they treated the natives very well, and in fact, many immigrants came to Pennsylvania seeking religious freedom. By 1700, Pennsylvania was the third most populous and wealthy colony, behind which two, want to guess? It's going to be Virginia and Massachusetts. William Penn never was fully liked by his colonists. They thought he was too friendly with James II, and he was arrested for treason 3 times. Thrice! You got to say thrice when it pops up in the text. He was arrested for treason thrice and thrown into prison. As you can see, several Quaker settlements flourished on the edge of Pennsylvania. New Jersey will become a royal colony in 1702, and in 1703, Delaware is granted its own assembly as well. So these middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, they'll come to be known collectively as the bread colonies because they, as you can see, export a lot of grain, and they're going to be feeding these sugar colonies in the West Indies, but also the southern colonies, Chesapeake, and New England as well to some extent. These are more ethnically mixed than any of the other colonies and more religiously tolerant than any of the other colonies, with the exception of, I suppose, Rhode Island. All right, thank you so much for watching. That's it for Chapter 3. We'll be taking a quiz on Chapters 1, 2, and 3, either the first or second day of class, most likely the second day of class. So be prepared for that. Take care.